everyone today? Alhamdulillah. First and foremost, before I begin, I would very much like to thank the Malaysian Institute of Defence and Security for inviting me to this bi-monthly dialogue. It's always an honor to be able to engage with experts at all levels, especially from this region and especially from Malaysia. Through our discussions, I very much look forward to learning from you, just as much as I hope you will gain from this talk. So I think MiDAS has allocated an hour to us, but throughout this presentation, we can make it very interactive. So as we move ahead, please feel free to ask me any questions, pitch in your contributions, and tweak any of the linkages which I will be showing you. I think this way, through this kind of discussion, we'll be able to leave this room with a much more comprehensive and holistic way of understanding how to assess maritime security in the Indo-Pacific. So before I begin, allow me to briefly introduce myself. You have the bio, I'm sure, but I'm a project manager and I work for the Stable Seas program and the One Earth Future Foundation, which is a foundation based out of Colorado. Currently, we have just recently released our report on the Sulu and Salleh Seas, and this report was produced in collaboration with the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime and also with the Maritime Institute of Malaysia. If you are interested in reading this report, please come to me. I'd really like to get to know you. We can have a discussion, and I will love to drop you an email of the report, and we also have a few supplementary documents. I've brought some as well. On top of this, we are producing other similar products. We're also looking at the Bay of Bengal after this, and we are also producing a Maritime Security Index. The index is available on our website, stableseas.org. And if you look at it currently, it just focuses on Africa. But this year, we will be taking that index, we will be spreading it across the Indian Ocean, and we will be assessing maritime security right until the Philippines. But today, we'll be focusing on a completely different topic. We'll be looking at a different way of assessing security in the Indo-Pacific through the Stable Seas approach. This approach is very much different from our current understanding of how we assess maritime security in the Indo-Pacific and also in the world. So let me try to figure out how to pakai ni. I think it's, okay, there we go. So currently, most policymakers in the Indo-Pacific tend to perceive maritime security developments through the perspective of major power competition. We all know the South China Sea is very well known for its tensions that have materialized between the United States and China. So while America is persisting with its freedom of navigation operations in the seas, you have China continuing to expand military infrastructure on contested islands. Meanwhile, you have Southeast Asian claimant states like Malaysia and Brunei that remain embroiled in a territorial dispute that takes place on highly contested waters that are filled with, abundant fishery stocks and lots of oil and gas deposits. But the problem with adopting this very narrow understanding of hard security concerns is that we tend to see the region's maritime security being determined by very tangible things, which is mostly the balance of military capabilities between regional powers. In this way, maintaining stability in the maritime security will then be attributed to more of the more impromptu diplomacy and the negotiating skills of policymakers in trying to diffuse these crises. By taking this narrow focus, we tend to forget other drivers of maritime security. And because of this, we cannot completely understand the roots of maritime security in this region, especially in Southeast Asia. But not to fear, we have the Stable Seas approach, which actually calls for experts to take a step back and to actually look at linkages between 9 different drivers of maritime security. By understanding these drivers, the region can work together to identify the root causes, establish practical solutions, and maintain safe waterways in the region. So if we were to look at Indo-Pacific, for example, we can see that maritime security can be determined by other factors, such as the global prices of oil and gas, such as unequal coastal development in the States, such as feelings of political exclusion being felt by people who live in these coastal communities, such as the overall exploitation of fisheries just to satisfy the demand of the local people and also for the international demand. And you have also illicit trades which make use of these waterways, to transport illegal wildlife trafficking and also the illegal movement of people. So we adopted the stable seas approach to look at a different way of understanding maritime security. We looked at the Sulu and Salleh seas first and foremost, and we decided to look at this area because here in the region you have the three most populous states, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. And all of these countries converge to share two bodies of water. So I will proceed as follows. I will first introduce the 9 drivers in the stable seas approach, and then I will then explain the linkages between these drivers, and then we can then together try and understand how these linkages impact maritime security. I'll then look into each of the drivers. I'll try and make it very brief. And then maybe after that, we can then have a discussion on what you think of how we can apply this approach to understanding maritime security from your perspective. Again, as I move ahead, please feel free to stop me and share your input as well. Okay, so what we have here are the 9 factors that can determine maritime security. As I mentioned earlier, we looked at the Sulu and Salleh seas, but these drivers were selected for their ability to impact activities that facilitate violence in the seas. So we first looked at we began with the facilitating factors, which would be coastal welfare and the rule of law, where we saw that having very underdeveloped coastal areas is quite detrimental to maritime security because they can be used as unregulated transit ports, or because they're economically weak, they can be used by other countries to assert their sovereign claims. We then look at the rule of law, where we argue that because some regions are very far away from political centers, these regions tend to have very weak level of enforcement. And because of that, there are also feelings of political disenfranchisement experienced by the people in these communities. Because of these 2 facilitating factors, these factors then create the environment for various other illicit activities. So these then lead to 4 other drivers. You have illegal fishing, you have piracy and armed robbery, you have illicit trades, you have maritime mixed migration. And because of these activities that continue, they then contribute back to establishing and further enforcing a very low level of coastal welfare and a very weak level of rule of law. But don't worry, not all is at stake. We also looked at 3 other factors that will be able to mitigate this very vicious cycle and make it more virtuous. We looked at the role of maritime enforcement, and we saw that having more coordination between...
Sorry, ma'am, to cut you.
Hi, no, brilliant, that's fine.
I don't know whether it's my eyes or the slide is very blurred.
The slide is blurred, primarily because it's expanded, and it's really close to the audience. If you're interested in this, again, as I said, please come up to me and I'll email it to you. Do you want me to, can you see it? I can move and point at the circles if you can't see it so
Only
clearly.
the big letters I can see, the small
Okay,
one,
great. That's
sorry.
brilliant. No, it's great. Please, continue. I really like this. So here we have coastal welfare. And because coastal welfare is weak, it interacts with a very poor level of rule of law. And a low level of rule of law takes place when a region is located far away from the political centers. So there's a low level of law enforcement and low economic development. These facilitating factors interact to create an environment that enables these illicit activities. So you have, here you have illegal fishing, which takes place because there's low enforcement. Here you have piracy and armed robbery. Here you have illicit trafficking, illicit trades. And you have the illegal movement of people cross-border, unregulated. And these activities continue. And because they consistently continue, it then further weakens the coastal welfare and the rule of law. And this then we call it the vicious cycle. But we're able to make this vicious cycle more virtuous if we looked at our mitigating factors, which would be maritime enforcement, by having more coordination between navies and also maritime law enforcement agencies, with international cooperation, by not only establishing multilateral initiatives, but also be able to enforce them, like the TCA. And also blue economy. I felt there's not enough emphasis on blue economy, but by building very economically strong coastal communities, we will be able to then tackle coastal welfare and then we will be able to remove the environment that facilitates these activities. So that would be our framework for now. If you guys would like a slide of this, which is clearer, please drop me an email, and I will love to share it with you. Yeah, and let me know if you can't see any slides clearly, because that helps as well. So this is what we're looking at. We're looking at the Sulu and Salleh Seas. The Sulu Sea is bordered by Sabah and Philippines. Well, I'm sure everyone knows this. But we looked at this region because it is critical, because almost 70% of goods that move from Australia and East Asia and vice versa, they tend to go through these seas as well. And also, because of this, illicit activities continue. You have issues like piracy and armed robbery, which undermine the movement of these goods. And this region is very critical because it takes place in a very complex political history. You have competing identities. And on top of that, you have very poor coastal welfare. So I will begin by looking at the first facilitating factor, which is coastal welfare. Again, I realize that the thing might be quite small, so let me know if you cannot see. I will love to explain it to you. Coastal welfare was highlighted as one of the facilitating factors, and it is important because coastal welfare is very closely tied to the global market, especially if that coastal region relies on natural commodities that compete in the international market. Because of this, poor coastal welfare can impact not only that region's ability to compete in the international market, but also the country's ability to compete in the international market. But we can't just sit back and say, oh yeah, it's really easy, we just need to ensure economic development. Because there are, in fact, other issues that tend to undermine coastal welfare. This would be issues such as political separatism, terrorism, shadow economies, and even organized crime. But we feel that it is very important to boost coastal welfare because of two reasons. The first is that having a very resilient economy will be able to reduce the role of black markets and also reduce the role of actors that rely on these black markets to profit from them. The second is that having thriving coastal communities will be able to address the historical economic grievances that drive these violent non-state actors to continue with their activities and to then resort to the maritime sphere to conduct activities that will bring in profit, that will fund their actions. So this is when we move to the graph. When we looked at the Sulu and Salleh region, we found two very interesting findings. The first is that all the areas around the Sulu and Salleh seas, from Indonesia, which is in brown, to Philippines, which is in blue, to Malaysia in green. Over there. Okay, great. So here you have, so the ones that are in brown are Indonesia. This here, yeah, I'll explain to you. So the ones here in brown are Indonesia, the one in blue are the Philippines, and the one in green is Malaysia. So this graph looks into the rise, the growth in the capita gross regional domestic product of that region, the economic growth, yeah, the rate of growth. And this in itself would be the GDP. So if we look at here, you have, you can see that the regions here are all very unequal in terms of economic development, right? You have places here, which is Kalimantan, which has a high gross regional domestic product. But if you see here, this is 0%. It is growing negatively, despite its high regional product, high regional gross domestic product. But then also you have other countries here which are lower in terms of GDP, but it is growing at a much faster rate at 15%. So we might have different coastal regions here, but all are growing at unequal rates. But if we were to look in the long term, this would mean that over time, all of these would eventually converge. They would all have a more or less equal economic condition. And this would mean that the coastal region would be equal in terms of economic development, and coastal welfare will be consistent. And one reason why we feel that Kalimantan is growing at a very regressive kind of rate is because it relies heavily on natural resources that are currently in decline. So you have the Tarakan Basin, for example, where you have a lot of oil and gas deposits. But then you have other regions that are trying to work on other kind of industries, which may be poorer, but are able to develop much faster economically. Also, our second finding is that in the Philippines, for example, we have the ARMM, Mindanao, the Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao. And that is being left behind by the Philippines. The rest of the Philippines is growing much, much faster than the ARMM. And this is because there is obviously, a lot of political disturbances taking place there. And this very much links to our second finding, which is that coastal welfare is very closely linked to maritime security. If you were to look at the ARMM, which is actually ranking last in terms of economic development, according to the Philippine Statistics Authority, several factors can be used to explain this discrepancy. The first being that the continued political instability in Mindanao undermines Mindanao's ability to close this gap in income inequality. So even if the rest of the region eventually converges and they're all more or less stabilized, you have Mindanao that will continue to be left behind. And this then creates a very vicious cycle of maritime security in which economic hardship only amplifies the root causes of political instability. In fact, as we all know, attacks in these regions continue in Sulu, Basilan, Lanao del Sur, and these attacks are very closely linked to the activities of Abu Sayyaf and also to the ongoing political competition between other groups like MNLF, MILF, and Maute.
Sorry, miss.
Mm-hmm.
I have to interrupt. Actually, I'm not clear with the variables. Is it the higher the GDP, the higher the rate of crimes, or is it the vice versa?
With this graph?
Yes, yes.
So what we're looking at over here is the rate of economic growth.
Okay.
So the rate of economic growth is compared. You find that rate by looking at the GDP at one instance, and then the next GDP over a period of time. You then conduct a comparison, and you see how fast the economy grows. That's how you measure the rate. Over here is the 2017 gross regional domestic product. So macam over here, for example, East Kalimantan is at 10,000 USD. But then, for example, you have these countries over here, these regions over here, which are way less than 2,000. But because this is at 15%, this shows that even if it is economically weak, it is still growing faster than regions such as Kalimantan. So if we were to plot it on another kind of graph, and if we were to measure their development over time, more or less these regions would then reach a balance, and they would all be equal in terms of economic development and economic growth. And then we achieve consistency in coastal welfare. Is that clear? Great. Please feel free to continue stopping me. It helps. So, coming back to that point which I mentioned earlier, what do we need to do to achieve this kind of balance in coastal welfare? The first is to look at regions like Kalimantan, and we need to start reducing our dependency on declining industries like oil and gas. For example, Northern Sulawesi's mining sector has enjoyed double-digit growth rates recently, contributing to Indonesia's highest growth rates across 5 years. So we need to start shifting the emphasis onto other industries. The second thing that we can do is that we can ensure regional security in that area. And Malaysia has actually done a really good job doing that by boosting onshore and offshore security with naval facilities in East Sabah and by also having ESCOM there. The next the next facilitating factor which we're looking at is the rule of law. So the main argument behind the rule of law is that coastal regions that are located very far away from their political capitals provide a vacuum that are likely to be filled by illicit organizations with subversive economic and political activities. So, for example, in the Sulu and Salleh seas, we found that when coastal regions are located in great distances away and across complex geographical terrains, this can undermine effective law enforcement. So if I were to show you here, you have Tarakan and you have Jakarta, which is 1,600 kilometers apart. Here between Sempurna and Kuala Lumpur is 1,800. But if you look at this, for example, you don't just look at it in terms of distance, like, oh yes, we have 1,006 between the coastal region and the capital, but you also have a sea in between that. You also have forests between that. You have mountains between that. And all this makes it very difficult for the political capital and coastal regions to establish that form of attachment, and also to maintain a very consistent state presence. So geographical terrains actually play a huge role. And because of these low levels of law enforcement, it then tends to encourage levels of corruption and also non-state actors like smugglers and traffickers. Another another concern in rule of law is the capital frontier discord, which is a term that we used in this report, where because of the great distances between the coastal regions and the political capital, people in the coastal region tend to associate themselves more with the coastal area and also with groups of people that are native to that region. This then gives feelings of political exclusion, and this then gives rise for calls of autonomy, which we all know is what happened with the Bangsamoro plebiscite. So what do we need to do to ensure the rule of law? Firstly, we need to ensure good governance. Local corruption needs to be curbed, and judicial integrity needs to be upheld, especially when there are under-resourced judicial systems in these areas, which really is not able to counter the ongoing illicit activities that tend to take place. Also, there needs to be an attempt to tackle these feelings of political exclusions. In these coastal regions, there needs to be more inclusive societies of people with different ethnicities, languages, and religion, and a very high level of tolerance. I'm aware that this is all much easier said than done, but in doing this, you are able to assess the rationale behind why we need to prioritize certain policy implementations. Why is there the emphasis on the rule of law? Why do we even need to implement these policies and ensure state presence? We're then able to understand that, okay, by ensuring a rule of law, we are eliminating a facilitating factor, and we are eliminating the environment that contributes to these as illicit activities. And in that way, we are then able to ensure maritime security within the Sulu and Salleh seas.
What about political will?
Sorry?
Political will.
Political will.
Yeah, because we really have rule of law. But again, if the central government don't have political will
Political will.
to enforce it, then it's still not going to work.
Exactly. Yeah.
Reflect most.
Exactly.
So even you talk about the disturbing between Tarakan and Jakarta, Kuala Lumpur, and
Yeah.
Sanakan, that's important.
Yeah.
But then again, the Colombo have the political will to ensure that
Yeah.
the safety and security of
Exactly.
the eastern part of Sabah to be keep on.
Mm-hmm.
But then again, but then again, you know about the politics of Indonesia.
Yeah.
I mean, they have their own laws in
Yeah.
Tarakan, in Banjarmasin, and whatever.
Mm.
So actually, Jakarta not really rule
Yeah.
Tarakan or
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. So exactly, this is the point that we need to emphasize more. Rule of law is not just determined. We have factors such as the geographical distance, which tears us apart, the coastal region and the political capital. But there are mitigating factors that we need to look at. I mentioned good governance. I said corruption needs to be curbed, but political will is another major issue. It's actually in our report, but I decided to not include it. I wasn't sure the level of sensitivity. But precisely my case, I completely agree. Political will needs to be there, and one of the whole rationale behind the stable seas approach is that we're able to justify why we need more political will in that area. If we're able to convince the political capitals that maritime security here is at stake. It is a threat to national security. Your oil and gas deposits are under threat by piracy and armed robbery. This is why we need to maintain state presence. This is why you need to allocate more political will to that area. Malaysia has already done that with ASCOM. Yeah, I completely agree. That's true. So having said that, we looked at the rule of law, we looked at the coastal welfare, and these two factors interact to produce a facilitating environment for several illicit activities. The first would be piracy and armed robbery. So piracy and armed robbery incidents have actually dropped sharply across Southeast Asia, but the threat still remains in the Sulu and Salleh seas. In fact, the primary mode of attack is through kidnapping for ransom incidents. According to RECAP, there has actually been a 25% decrease in the total of incidents being reported from 2017 to 2018. In fact, as I mentioned, the threat still continues because from January 2014 to January 2019, a total of 85 crew members were kidnapped. in this area. And as we can all see, most of the incidents take place along the 400-kilometer arc from Lahat Datu all the way through Sulu Archipelago and up to Zamboanga in Mindanao. And most of the hostages are being taken on from fishing boats and tugboats. But also at stake, as I mentioned earlier, there has been a 25% decrease, and this can be due to the maritime enforcement and international cooperation, which has been taking place between the three governments. Also, we have bodies like RECAP, IMB's Piracy Reporting Center, and we have the International Fusion Center in Changi, which conducts very strong incident reporting and response coordination. So, although the threat still remains, there has been some improvement in this area. However, the regional community needs to continue remaining vigilant and to continue advancing cooperation and enforcement initiatives from the TCA to the ASCOM. Another issue that is hardly looked at but is still very detrimental to maritime security is fisheries, where the problem with fisheries is the overexploitation of fish stocks in the region's waters. So the problem is here, I'm not sure if you can see, but over here are overexploited areas, just next to Brunei. Then you have the fully fished area, and over here are still areas that are okay. But if we were to continue in this manner, we're going to continue overexploiting our fishery stocks. And this does not just mean not enough fish for us, but also it means that we're pushing our fishing community to other illicit activities, especially when there are not enough resources out there for them to fish, and especially their livelihoods rely on this. There is a concern that instead of using their fishing boats to fish, they will use their fishing boats to do something else, which will undermine maritime security. We saw that most fishing takes place in the Celebes Seas, and this is heavy industrial fishing. And in fact, overfishing has a huge impact on the country's economic growth rate. In 2002, an assessment estimated that losses due to overfishing and the destruction of marine environment can cost the Philippines $2.5 billion US dollars, and it can cost Indonesia $2.6 billion US dollars. Overexploited fisheries are a result of various activities such as illegal fishing, IUU fishing, illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing done by domestic and foreign boats, cyanide bombing, where they want to keep the fish alive, so then they throw the cyanide and they stun it. But the problem is that you also kill the coral reefs, you kill the marine environment, and you imbalance the ecosystem. Also, shark catch continues and it's very high. From 2000 to 2010, Malaysia's shark catch was a total of 2.9% of the global catch. Indonesia's was 13.1%. A lot of transshipment takes place as well, where fish that are caught domestically are then brought out to Indonesia's exclusive economic zone and then transported into another foreign fishing vessel. So you're unable to keep your fish stocks within the territorial jurisdiction. And then you have violation of licenses. Vessels operate without licenses, they don't use proper fishing gear, restricted fishing zones are encroached, and you have poaching of turtles as well. So what can we do to improve fishery stocks? Actually, not much has been done. There has been several initiatives, like the Coral Triangle initiatives, but enforcement is not so strong. The only thing that we can look at is Indonesia's decision to ban all foreign fishing vessels from their waters. And in fact, if they are found, they will then be detonated. This was done since 2014. And this has shown tremendous results. Foreign fishing in Indonesia has declined by 90% since 2014, and Indonesia's fishing stocks are still able to grow. Yet, the rule of law remains weak in this area. There is a lack of enforcement, and coastal monitoring mechanisms are very ill-equipped. As you can see, this then always falls back to rule of law and coastal welfare. The third issue are stuff like illicit trades, which I'm sure you're very aware of. Legal illicit trades takes place with cigarettes, drugs, wildlife trafficking, timber, fuel, and the illegal exchange of contraband across borders. Illicit trade can definitely impact a country negatively, especially in terms of tax revenue. In fact, the Philippines loses $750 million US dollars every year just because of fuel smuggling. Illicit trades are driven by, again, challenging geography and poor maritime domain awareness, weak state presence, corruption, coastal poverty as well. So then, this is the fourth issue that tends to take place because of poor coastal welfare and because of poor rule of law. This would be the movement of people. As we are well aware, a lot of people move from the Philippines into Sabah because of the attraction of economic incentives, especially from the palm plantations. So this would be the pull factor, but they're also being pushed out by the political violence that takes place in other areas in the region. Another concern that is related to mixed migration is the movement of foreign fighters, which is unregulated. How are we supposed to be able to monitor the movement of people coming in from the Middle East and all the way down to the Philippines without, especially there are still gaps in policy and enforcement. So our report actually proposed that more maritime capacity against smuggling is needed. And also a very formal policy framework is needed to process the migration flows of people. Okay, so that would be illicit activities. And we have also looked at the facilitating factors that contribute to these activities. And right now we're going to look at what can we do to mitigate these activities? What can we do to improve the environment? Well, we have maritime enforcement, where the naval force and maritime law enforcement agencies in the three countries have demonstrated a very strong commitment to build maritime domain awareness in the Sulu and Celebes region. They've strengthened their naval presence, they've enhanced their enforcement efforts, and they've also strengthened regional initiatives. However, these efforts continue to be hampered by issues such as difficult geographical terrain, competing strategic priorities, there's the issue of reduced defense budget, institutional constraints, and also overlapping mandates. What we commonly came across as we spoke to naval officers was that, oh, how are we supposed to dedicate our resources to the Sulu and Celebes Seas when everyone is more interested in the South China Sea? There's the issue of Indonesia and the Natuna Islands where they feel that this then detracts the attention away from this part of the region. Another factor which we can look at is blue economy, which I find personally quite interesting. Blue economy, by enhancing blue economy, we are not saying that the region does not have any blue economy industries. In fact, the coastal regions in the Sulu and Celebes Seas first began as thriving blue economy hubs. Until now, this part of the region remains reliant on income sourced from these industries. It is therefore very important for us to maintain these blue economy industries to protect the coastal welfare of these countries. In Sabah, for example, businesses that are related to the reefs, it can bring in over $635 million to Malaysia every year. And also Malaysia's tourism industry is expected to grow to 14.4% of Malaysia's GDP by 2028. Tourism is also going to give Malaysia more jobs. Areas such as northern Sulawesi, for example, they're very dependent on fisheries. But the problem with fisheries is that most of the fish being fished here are then brought to the canneries in the Philippines. So you're pulling out fish from the domestic sources and you're then contributing it to elsewhere. And this is because the blue economy industries in this region are not protected. The labor market in these areas are not protected. And so it is very difficult to ensure that these blue economy industries are sustainable. As we all know, the third one would be international cooperation. I think this has been very good recently. In fact, as we all know, the trilateral cooperative arrangement was set in 2006, which came with naval patrols and also an aerial component. Other initiatives for initial cooperation is the Unodc contact group meeting. The first one was held in August last year. The second one was last month, which is also where we launched our Sulu and Celebes Seas report. Other concepts that have been discussed to enhance international cooperation would be the ASEAN Coast Guard Forum and also the ASEAN Maritime Single Point of Contact. However, some concerns continue to remain. I mean, we're dealing with 3 different countries here. How do we develop and maintain trust? How do we deal with overlapping mandates? And how do we avoid the duplication of efforts? So as we move forward in terms of international cooperation, there needs to be a subtle shift from prioritizing hard major power competition towards more collaborative goals on how we can work together to enhance other factors in maritime security. Also, the more information gaps need to be filled. Currently, we need to better understand how the different policymakers in this region understand maritime security threats, and also understand how these threats impact coastal welfare and the rule of law, and vice versa. So that would be our stable seas approach, which I feel gives us a very different, but I think a more accurate set of lens to assessing maritime security in the Indo-Pacific. The value of our approach is that it's not just theoretical. In fact, it has high policy relevance, and it can in fact be applied quite well as well. By moving forward, I think it's good for us to focus on each driver, identify how that driver impacts maritime security, and then reach effective policy suggestions. In fact, the value of studying these linkages have already been recognized by regional policies in this area. Since the release of our report, we've been working with a few regional agencies that have proposed preliminary research to better identify how we can manipulate these links and what kind of policy approaches do we need. So by continuing to pursue such a comprehensive approach this way, we at Stable Seas believe that the root causes of maritime insecurity can be effectively addressed through very effective solutions, which can then be able to guarantee a sustainable maritime security in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you very much for your kind attention and for the questions, and I look forward to a very engaging discussion. Thank you very much.
Yeah, if I may ask a question. I'm Ramli Hajinik from Defense University, Malaysia. At the outset, let me thank you for your presentation. Very important to us and very long facts. I like that. First, I give a comment and first question. If you way back in year 2000, Sulu Sea is known as ungoverned waters. Ungoverned waters, because it's difficult to govern, poor rule of law. Many threats exist in the region, okay, in that particular area. Now, then we come back to the coming or present situation or current situation as to why there is poor rule of law, limited coastal development. I thought one of the main reasons is the level of threat. Way back in the early year 2000 to 2005, 2006, increase of piracy in Sri Lanka led to the establishment of Ice in the Sky by three notorious states, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore. And that reduced the level of threat tremendously. And again, as mentioned earlier by my friend, that is Captain, the political will of the government to ensure the stability, peace, period. All right? Nevertheless, when you look at Sulu Sea, the fact that being harvested way back as ungoverned waters, the many threat. So the threat is there, but there's not enough enforcement, like I say, enforcement from all the three little states. Why? Because they got politics at the area. A good case in point, Indonesia. They got so many islands, 2,004 islands. To cover Sulu Sea, they made another naval vessel. That's I was thinking that way back last year, the naval officer from that side, and they say that issue of fleet. Therefore, though we have established the agreement by three level states, but I don't think it is that very effective because of the enable to pursue the normal what we call patrolling, limited vessels by the especially from PP. They are very limited. Secondly, with respect to security per se, in that area, the state has invested so much money actually, constructing radar from tip of our side up to Philippines. And Washington DC can see what's happening actually, because they're concerned about the movement of certain group. So on that security alone, that's why the fact that two countries are not putting effort, because they know that the security with respect to the movement of grouping like Abu Sayyaf will be fully monitored by the police. So, in my question for you, how best you do to ensure that the three little states, Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia, adopt a certain sort of policy to enhance the development of the coastal state and to increase the blue economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. I'm not just going to answer the question, but I think I should summarize what you said because you raised some very important points. I think firstly, we looked at, well, you mentioned that the unregulation of these waters harks way back to the historical nature of the Sulu and Salleh seas, which is correct. In our report, we mentioned the impact of the Sulu Sultanate, actually, and that could be a historical reason for the continuing threat. Also, because of this, you have the overstretch of naval resources. Indonesia, you're right, Indonesia does say, you know, we have our land stretching all the way from Aceh all the way up to Papua, and so many islands, so many terrains, you know, it's not like it's all sea, so you just have naval vessels. No, you need amphibious vessels, you need to be able to have complemented with land-based operations too. And because of this, it is difficult to maintain such a level of naval enforcement. I completely agree. Having said that, I'd like to know your views really on the role that other maritime law enforcement agencies can play, such as the Coast Guards. Do you think the Philippines Coast Guard, Bakamla, or even MMEA, do you think that they have a role to play as well in complementing this area? And if so, how and when? Before that, we then looked into our reliance on other external partners for our security. Maybe America can monitor our ASG movements, and the CIA can then just let us know, and we can react that way. But having said that, we're not taking accountability of our own security environment, and that is something we need to do, because especially as we don't just have America, we also have other interested emerging powers in this region. So, you know, enhancing our national sovereignty and our own accountability for the security in this region is very important. And you then asked me, how would you ensure these three littoral states adopt a policy to enhance development of these coastal states? I'm so glad you brought that up because last month during the Unodc contact group meeting, there was an agreement that more research is needed, impartial research is needed to understand how coastal welfare affects maritime security. We were then tasked, I'm actually in the midst of discussing this with UNODC, we were then tasked with producing a poverty alleviation report to understand what kind of policies are needed to alleviate poverty in these areas with implications on maritime security. But this report is important not just because of the report that was produced, but it's important because the need for this report was recognized by all three countries that attended that meeting, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. So I think in moving forward, we need to better understand our security environment, especially as we want to take more ownership over it. And therefore, we need to have more detailed understanding, impartial research, and we have to understand everyone's different views. Indonesia may have a different view from Malaysia and the Philippines, but we're all rational actors here. So yeah, that would be my answer. Thank you very much for that. Yes, please.
Dr. Tarishni from National Defense University in Malaysia. Hi. Talking about your topic, I'm quite interested in Indo-Pacific. So I'd just like to share some thoughts and also a question to you. Last week I was in Myanmar and there was this Vietnam speaker, and he was also talking something that has a similar dimension to what you are talking about. You talked about, you know, this coastal development, welfare, blue economy, and you know, overfishing issues and international cooperation and all that. So he kind of related it to his Vietnam's current maritime strategy, which has been reviewed. So I would like to know, given your PhD is on U.S. foreign policy and in relation to Indo-Pacific, can I say, or can I assume that the Indo-Pacific strategy is towards this direction, as in helping the maritime states along the Indo-Pacific sphere, or what is actually Indo-Pacific is all about? Because in my understanding, Indo-Pacific it's an informal security dialogue between four major countries: the US, Japan, and Australia, and India, and it was perceived to be an attempt to balance the rise of China, because China was excluded in the Indo-Pacific. So, how does this Indo-Pacific kind of fits your thought in what we have presented today? Can you kind of share your views on how that fits to your views and your presentation today?
Thank you very much. Is the Vietnamese speaker from DAV?
Oh, yeah.
He's from DAV. Okay, great. Thank you. DAV is a good maritime security think tank in Vietnam, as we all know. And we actually shared our article with them. So we wrote an article on stable seas and we shared it with them. So I hope that our approach informed their views in some way. Okay, so I think your question was on what are my views on the Indo-Pacific and how then does that relate to our stable seas approach in the region. Okay, great. So the Indo-Pacific's, my awareness, my perspective of the Indo-Pacific concept began when I was at the Shangri-La Dialogue last year, and Narendra Modi then announced his Indo-Pacific speech. It was a very long talk, which was very good. It had a lot of impact, so much so that our dinner was delayed by like an hour. But it was extremely, impactful. We realized that India was making a new stand in this region, and we had to accommodate India. We had to recognize India's role, and we had to always have India in our periphery whenever we discuss regional issues. You mentioned that perhaps it could be a concept to balance against the rise of China. I feel that China is always welcome to be part of Indo-Pacific, if it wishes to. It would be America's official line. And I may do my PhD in US foreign policy, but I work for an American nonprofit, so I don't represent anyone's views, really. Also, there was one thing I wanted to mention. All right, so what do you think Indo-Pacific, okay. So America's idea of the Indo-Pacific concept is rather to be able to create a more inclusive region. And it does not aim specifically to help the coastal welfare and economic development of countries along the littoral states, but rather it aims to maintain freedom of navigation in the seas. It just wants to ensure that there is constantly open waterways. Having said that, I feel that we have this tendency, coming out from the Cold War, to be reliant on external partners, on America's role, and maybe China's role in the region as well. But I strongly believe that we might be able to accept or embody this Indo-Pacific concept, but ultimately regional security lies onto us. We should be the ones trying to ensure coastal welfare development in this region, and we should be the ones trying to ensure maritime security is safe. In fact, that should be our role and not really America's or China's, in my opinion. We can continue this conversation later for sure. I think it'd be quite interesting. Thank you.
Hi.
Just writing from that.
Sure.
The term Indo-Pacific itself, you probably explain it a little further, because I think it's only of late that we've been using that. And I think Darshini had made a point there. I think since the rising of India that we start, using that term. So all this while we've been using the Asia-Pacific term. So geographically, well, I must be honest here, even the Asia-Pacific, I find it like mind-boggling where exactly, the geographical border is. So now comes this one. So how will that term Indo-Pacific really influence the overall geopolitics of, basically, well, we call it just regional waters here, and all this while we just say that we are part of the Asia-Pacific. So can you, enlighten us on that?
Yeah, definitely. I feel that my thoughts would very closely reflect yours, being a person of this region as well. When Indo-Pacific first came about, there was a lot of questions on what does this concept mean? What does it mean for our identity? Why are we no longer Asia-Pacific? Why should we then, adopt a larger concept? And I feel if you were to speak to scholars out there, you had Obama's rebalancing strategy. And now that has left us. And now we have Trump in place with an Indo-Pacific concept. So there is a lot of doubt or question on whether this may merely be a rhetorical term. In fact, its strategic, implications of it has not been fully ascertained, whether If you were to speak to consulates from the U.S. Embassy, they'd be like, oh, we just want to ensure, open navigations in the seas. Having said that, I feel that the Indo-Pacific concept was forwarded purely because we need to involve the roles of other countries as well, primarily, as mentioned, India, Australia, the Quad rather, Japan, Korea. And by allowing them to play a larger role within the region, we'd be able to create a more inclusive region. Having said that, ever since the Indo-Pacific came about, that came about around the same time that, not long after America pulled out of the TPP. And there was a lot of concern that, oh, with America retracting its presence from the region, how then would that affect regional's continuous stability? But the region stood up. It stood up to the plate. It created the TPP-11. We didn't need America. And actually moving forward, maybe we don't really need any other powers ourselves. We need to be more accountable for our security. So all the concepts like this does definitely concern us, obviously being part of a global strategic landscape. At the end of the day, we should be internally looking at ourselves and to question, are we Southeast Asia? Where is ASEAN's relevance right now? What is our sovereign claims right now? How do we stand as national countries in relation to one another, rather than having our feathers, fluffed up by, the involvement of other emerging powers as well. Thank you.
Okay, now one more question.
Oh, definitely, be great.
Your presentation.
Yeah.
It's nicely how you have put it, looking at from 9 angles. But there was a paper by MIMA, I believe, a few years back. I think they were saying about all these things, all this problem at sea, it all originates from land. And the kinetic is at sea, and then it ends at land. But I don't see somehow, in any of your research, covering those, basically, what matters on land. And we come up with something brilliant, like, the Navy working together out in the sea. But in the end, things happen, it ends in the land. So, on your research, looking at that, what should be done on land?
Yeah, of course. Maritime security is in fact an extension of developments on land. We strongly believe that, and in fact that is reflected in our framework. We looked at how coastal welfare needs to be enhanced. Coastal welfare is the welfare of people that live on the coast. So this would be on land. And we recognize that issues such as political instability can be detrimental to maritime security. And political instability would refer to developments such as, for example, the Bangsamoro plebiscite, the Marawi siege. All that has connection to activities on the seas as well. And we also mentioned how we need to look at the rule of law. And that would also be developments that happen on land.
Should you be proposing something similar? Like, international community can work, navies to navies, at sea. But would you suggest something, of international in nature on land? Don't you have that sort of?
Or do you think it's a conundrum?
Macam ada recommendation from your findings
on how we can.
Yeah, because if think tanks like you guys start talking on that, then we can do something concrete on that.
Definitely.
Which has been the challenge here.
Right.
Because we're quite comfortable, being out there.
Yeah. Yeah.
But nobody really, gets into the nitty-gritty part of, sovereignty, not at stake things. But in the end, maybe you were saying other agencies involved. Of course, the police definitely. They are basically the main agency. In the end, that has the final say to all this crime. So I think this proposal that probably come from your institute should look into that area too.
Definitely. I think with our Stable Seas approach, we don't just want to produce reports just like that. We want it to have strong policy relevance. And to be able to do that, we need to identify policy gaps. And to identify policy gaps, we need the demand from policy agencies, maritime law enforcement agencies. We don't want to just look into all the gaps, maybe like pinpoint on one. There needs to be a niche. So definitely we're looking into how we can work, how we can then propose certain types of naval cooperation, but we want it to have policy impact as well. And I'd be delighted to take this conversation, of course, if you feel there are certain areas or niche areas that we should look at as well. Hi, oh sorry, I think you came first.
Yes, you did address on the land sea nexus, Shen Purnima. Actually attended the ASEAN Regional Forum on Single Point of Contact, and we actually did brainstorming sessions, so based on policy and technical groups. So mainly in technical group, we're having this Coast Guard, Bakamla in ASEAN regions, and pretty much like we have analyzed like certain things that need to be addressed for maritime security, and pretty much like the conclusion is that we're having this the maritime security awareness, which is maritime domain awareness, and the importance of sharing information. So that's the thing that we really highlighted in the ASEAN Regional Forum. So, ma'am, for the role of maritime domain awareness, how do you see it in this addressing maritime security?
Yeah, thank you. Please call me Asyura. Yeah, I completely agree. Information sharing is in fact the key in moving forward, and it is the key in enhancing maritime domain awareness for sure. I think that the discussion during the forum that you attended reflects the working group that we attended in Manila at the Unodc contact group as well. We realized that there's not enough information being shared across all agencies, and therefore we need to try centralize it all. Another outcome from that is that because of that, Stable Seas is going to work closely with Unodc to try build an index that will also cover Southeast Asia, so we can all share our information that way, and it will all be publicly available. Having said that, in our report on the Maritime Enforcement section, we actually looked into the role of maritime domain awareness. We looked into the capacities that currently exist, from radar to the role of the Coast Guards, and we also identified gaps. And at the end of the day, it all boils down to the fact that there is not enough information being shared because of institutional constraints, but also because we just don't know enough. There's not enough research out there that will be able for us to establish a common understanding of what's going on, what drives coastal welfare, what are the policy gaps in the rule of law that takes place in these areas, how can we improve it, what is the role of the NCWC, the National Coast Watch Center in the Philippines, how effective is that? How then do they work with the Philippines Navy? I know they deputize the Navy to conduct some patrols, but to what extent is that helpful? So I feel that there are still gaps in these areas that need to be addressed so we can build a maritime domain awareness. And I completely agree with your assessment.
Kanata from MPT.
Hi.
Thank you for a good elaboration on stability. However, I can on the surface, I can see that you're talking about local conflict actually in Mindanao, that some sort of floodgate or overflow was the region. And talking about cooperation, talking about policy. However, you do not touch really on the leadership, because you can see that when Jokowi, UKT, and you mentioned now, when we are talking about the importance of maritime, then I really concur with the awareness. Okay? But to what extent the leadership and also the conflict resolution in Mindanao, you have touched, or they can contribute to the stability approach. That's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for that question. As our report is publicly available, there is a reason why we didn't talk about much on political leadership. We didn't pinpoint Jokowi. I mean, you have the elections coming up in Indonesia. Bangkok is undergoing an election this weekend, and you have Singapore probably. So it's a very volatile landscape we're in now. So we tried to be as careful as possible. But that does not discount the fact that it is a seriously critical factor, leadership, and that also ties in with political